You know, if you really want to understand a country, you can't just read its history books. You've got to read its novels. So today, we're going to dive into the story of America's identity, a story told through the powerful, diverse, and, yeah, often conflicting voices of its greatest writers.
From the very beginning, the United States was founded on this really powerful idea, e pluribus unum, out of many, one. The whole idea was to forge a single, unified nation from all these different peoples and colonies. It's a beautiful concept, right? But it immediately came with a huge question mark. Who exactly was included in that one? Because from the get-go, this promise of unity, well, it wasn't for everyone. Native Americans were here first, African Americans brought here in chains, and women from all backgrounds were pretty much left out of that founding vision. And that fundamental tension has been the engine driving American literature ever since. And this gets us to a really central shift in the American story. The journey away from this idealized myth, the melting pot, to a reality that's way more complex, way more challenging, and frankly, a lot more interesting.
So you've got these two totally competing visions for the nation. On one side, you have the melting pot, where assimilation means all your cultural differences basically just disappear into one dominant culture. But on the other side, there's this more radical idea, cultural pluralism, where all these diverse cultures can coexist and keep what makes them unique, actually contributing to a stronger whole.
As early as 1924, this philosopher, Horace Kallen, offered this incredible alternative. He didn't see America as a melting pot at all, but as an orchestra. I mean, think about that. Each instrument is distinct, it has its own sound, but together they create a much richer harmony. This idea would become a rallying cry for authors who wanted to tell a different kind of American story. So how did this whole orchestra idea start to take shape in literature? Well, it all started when the first major challenges to that mainstream narrative came from voices that had been silenced for way too long. Okay, so to get what happens next, you have to understand this massive historical shift, the Great Migration. Millions of African Americans left the segregated South and moved to northern cities looking for work and a better life. This didn't just change the country's demographics, it lit the fuse on a cultural explosion. You can just feel the energy of the time. The critic Elaine Locke nailed it, declaring that the pulse of the Negro world has begun to beat in Harlem. This was the absolute heart of the Harlem Renaissance, an incredible explosion of art and music and literature where a new, confident Black identity was being built. But this era also got really deep into the inner lives of people on the margins. W.E.B. Du Bois gave us this crucial term, double consciousness. He used it to describe that feeling of always looking at yourself through the eyes of others. This two-ness, being both American and Black, became a central, powerful theme for a whole generation of writers. And this literary tradition, it wasn't static. It was constantly evolving. It moved from that cultural celebration of the Harlem Renaissance with incredible writers like Zora Neale Hurston to the really stark protest literature of Richard Wright in the 40s, and then, ultimately, to the revolutionary fire of the Civil Rights era with icons like James Baldwin and Alice Walker. Now, at the same time the Civil Rights movement was reshaping the country, another revolution was kicking off. The second wave of feminism created this explosion in literature that finally gave a powerful voice to the experiences and frustrations of women in a patriarchal society. I mean, these writers were breaking every single mold. Sylvia Plath's Bell Jar became this perfect metaphor for feeling suffocated by society. They questioned everything, the rigid roles of wife and mother, the lack of control over their own bodies. And they started exploring female sexuality with this new, unapologetic honesty in books like Erica Jong's Fear of Flying. So, the door is starting to open, right? And the American literary conversation is about to get a whole lot bigger and a whole lot louder as more voices from the margins start to join in. So then a new movement emerges, the Native American Renaissance. Authors like N. Scott Momaday and Leslie Marmon Silko directly took on that damaging myth of the vanishing Indian. They weren't just writing novels. By weaving ancient oral traditions into modern stories, they were powerfully rewriting a history that had ignored them for centuries. They were reclaiming their past to define their own future. Then you have Jewish American novelists who for over a century have just masterfully captured the immigrant experience. Their work digs so deep into that profound, often really painful tension between trying to hold on to an old world identity while chasing the promises and the pressures of the American dream. And in the 1970s and beyond, Asian American writers like Maxine Hong Kingston and Amy Tan brought completely new themes to the table. They wrote so powerfully about the cultural clashes between immigrant parents and their American-born kids, and explored this complex, beautiful idea of an imaginary homeland, that deep connection to a place you may have never even seen.
So, what happens when all these new voices start talking at once? Well, the very idea of a single, fixed identity just starts to dissolve. And this leads to a new frontier in the American novel, exploring the spaces where cultures aren't just living side by side, but are actually mixing and creating something brand new.
A perfect example of this is the term Chicano, or Chicana. It was actually once a slur, but it was reclaimed during the Civil Rights era as a proud badge of a hybrid identity. Not fully Mexican, not fully Anglo-American, but a powerful, unique fusion of both. This idea was so revolutionary, it actually inspired a whole new academic field. Thanks to brilliant thinkers and writers like Gloria Anzaldúa, we now have border studies, which teaches us to see borderlands not as edges where America ends, but as these central, dynamic zones where new American identities are constantly being forged.
And that story, it is far from over. The American novel keeps evolving, pushing into new frontiers of identity and experience that reflect a country that's always changing.
Take Arab American literature, for instance. It's not one single thing. It's a complex history with really distinct phases. You have the early Christian immigrants, then later waves of writers who identified more strongly as Arab, and finally, a modern politicized generation whose voices became especially urgent after 9/11.
Another really powerful frontier that's emerging is what we call disability narratives. These novels are fundamentally challenging our ideas about what's normal and what's different by moving the experiences of physical and mental disability from the margins right to the center of the story. And while the genre might feel new, it actually has deep, deep roots in the American canon. I mean, classic novels like these have been using characters with disabilities for decades to comment on how society treats anyone it considers an outsider. It just shows how literature keeps finding new ways to explore what it means to be on the margins. So we end with this amazing idea from the great novelist Henry James. He called the novel a house of fiction with many, many windows, and each one offers a different view of the world. The story of the American novel really has been about activists and artists fighting to pry open new windows, demanding that we see the nation from their perspective. And that leaves us with a really fascinating question. What new window, what new voice is going to open next?